We are Karen and Herb Ford. We are the founders of the New Jersey Jewish Film Festival. Welcome to our 20th year. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I hope you will continue to check the schedule on the website and keep watching. It's been an unusual year, but we've gotten great feedback. We'd like to hear yours. So I would like to thank our sponsors for this evening, Sue Rudd and Sylvia Steiner, our community partners, Jerot at the Synagogue of Suburban Torah Center, and Temple Sinai, the Renaissance Group. I would also like to thank our friends from the JCC Central for joining us tonight. I would also like to give a special thank you to Sarah Diamond and the staff at the JCC for pulling this together. It was a new experiment for all of us, and I think they've done a great job. I'd like to introduce the director, writer, excuse me, and producer of the film tonight, Oren Rudavsky. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and several National Endowment for the Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts grants. In addition to this, to Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People, he produced Witness Theater, a film chronicling a self-help organized workshop between Holocaust survivors and high school students, which premiered last year at the 2019 festival. He has a whole list of films and projects he has worked on: A Life Apart, Hasidim in America, Hiding and Seeking, which was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award. He also was the producer of media for the small and large screen permanent installations at the Russian Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. That could probably be a whole nother picture. He produced a series of profile documentaries for Bloomberg Television called Risk Takers. He was the producer and writer of a two-part series called Time for School 3. He did The Treatment and Baby Makes Two, Spark Among the Ashes. He's been very prolific. I'm going to stop here, though, and I am going to introduce our second guest this evening, who is a local guy. Michael Rothfeld is an investigative reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times and co-author of The Fixers. He was previously an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. At the Journal, he was a leader of the reporting team that won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting for the coverage of the hush money deals made on behalf of Donald Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign. At the Los Angeles Times, his stories on abuse of government perks led to the firings and resignations of cabinet members and state board members of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's administration. He also reported for Newsday, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and was awarded the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Michael lives in Brooklyn with his daughters, but he grew up in New Jersey, and he is the son of our New Jersey Jewish Film Festival member, Evelyn Rothfeld. So I am going to hand it over to you gentlemen now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us and me. Great to see everyone. And Oren, very nice to meet you. Congratulations. This was a great film. I really enjoyed it. And obviously Pulitzer has run through my life in a lot of ways. Going to the Columbia Journalism School myself, which is named after him, and the fellowship, and just kind of as a model in my journalism career of, holding power to account. So I really learned a lot, and that I did not know. And so I'm wondering, just kind of an easy question, if you could tell us how this project came about, and what made you want to do this film about Joseph Pulitzer.
Sure. There's a man named Bob Seidman, who was my co-writer and co-producer on the film. And we had worked together many years ago on a film called A Life Apart, Hasidism in America. And Bob writes novels based on historical figures. And one of the characters he's been trying to write a novel about for many years is Joseph Pulitzer. And he was telling me about it, and we started talking about whether any decent film had been made. And the fact is, none had been made, surprisingly enough. I don't really know why exactly, because Pulitzer is a fascinating, unusual strain. His personal biography is really interesting, and his professional biography is kind of legendary and misrepresented by the Newsies and other films. But I think William Randolph Hearst got a lot more ink and screen time because of Citizen Kane, and if Orson Welles had made Citizen whatever about Pulitzer, perhaps people know nothing about Pulitzer. And so when I started reading his biography, I was really interested, but I couldn't kind of get a sense of who the man was until I read this book by one of his secretaries named Aline Ireland, who spent the last year of his life on the boat that Pulitzer traveled across the ocean back and forth with. And his book was called Adventures with a Genius. And there are a few titles for it, but that's one of them. And that just brought the man to life, and his idiosyncrasies, his strangeness, the fact that he went blind, was losing his sight very early on and eventually went blind, but kept up his ferocious pace up till the end. And so it was a natural, and we went about that endless process of getting funding for it.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating episode at the end of the film, and something I had no idea about. So I'm wondering. Obviously, Pulitzer is a very well-known name, but as you said, I guess there's not been a lot known about him, or a movie about him. But I mean, from your perspective, like as you were doing it, what do you feel like was the most surprising in terms of like broadening that you were able to do in the film, through the film, to broaden the public understanding of who he was by actually taking that on?
Yeah, but by the way, I just want to mention there's also a biography by Jamie Morris, a few years, that came out just a few years before we made the film, and that sort of brought him back into light. But we started this project before our president was even imagined or unimagined, and something we share. I know you've done a lot of work on trying to reveal the wrongdoings of this guy, and one of the things Pulitzer, throughout his life, from the very beginning, was he was an investigative reporter. One of his first cases, where he was trying to find out what when he went to St. Louis, and I'm not answering your question, I know that, but I'll come back to it. But one of his first cases in St. Louis, he heard that the city government was having a closed door meeting, and he had one of his reporters drill a hole in a closet wall that fed into, it's one of those great stories that's not in the film, but that fed into the room where they were discussing whatever they were discussing, and had his reporters take down notes. and so he understood what his public wanted and needed, and it was really a new era. There had been many eras. I mean, the history of newspaper business in the U.S. is long and complicated, but he became, kind of the modern image of an investigative reporter who, you understand only too well. But remind me what your question was, because I don't think I answered it.
I just I asked you what surprised you in terms of what you learned about him, or that you felt like, how you felt the film kind of broadened how he has been seen by history.
Yeah, well, I just was surprised by how people, immigrants, this is an immigrant story, and it's a great immigrant story, and it always surprises me how immigrants get us better than we get ourselves. And that's something, famously de Tocqueville understood and wrote about. But I think Pulitzer, this combination of embracing America and American ideals and democratic ideals and ideals of free speech, and this willingness to tell all, to leave no prisoners behind, to just tell. It was the first time in St. Louis again where tax dodgers, who were part of all the rich, polite society, their names were printed in the newspaper, that they didn't pay any taxes. So the degree to which he was willing, even when he himself became wealthy, to make enemies. And, famously to the end, he said, I have no friends. And I can't have any friends, because if you have friends as a newspaper man, you can't tell the truth. And I think for him, he truly didn't have many friends, because he was quite a difficult man. So that's part of what I found interesting about him. Plus the whole blindness part of his story, and the fact this guy who built a boat that was only a few feet shorter than J.P. Morgan's boat and traveled back and forth. He was vastly wealthy. But he still stuck to his principles and ideals, and the Pulitzer family did until they sold the newspaper. They kept their liberal politics, even though lots of others, Hearst famously, did not, nor does Hearst Publications in general.
Yeah, he's quite a fascinating character, and in terms of just having all that money and remaining kind of an outsider in that way, and holding to that principle. And just a kind of a side note, that anecdote you mentioned, which is not in the film, about spying through a hole and the kind of surveillance, which is sort of things that we can't do. We're not really allowed to do that, illegal surveillance, or I don't know if it's illegal, but in any case. But in my reporting for my book, one of the things we did reporting on was the National Enquirer, because the National Enquirer was kind of aiding and abetting President Trump, or during his campaign, by paying off a Playboy model. And so in my book, we kind of did a little history on the National Enquirer. And, most people don't realize that, like, traditionally, some of the tabloid reporters who are more aggressive are actually really, they have a reputation as being sensationalist, but and they are, but some of the great reporters have worked for some tabloids. And one anecdote that I found out about, I don't know if it was in my book, was like when they were investigating, the Star, which is an affiliated publication of the National Enquirer, was investigating John Benet Ramsey's murder, in Minnesota. They like sent a flower pot to the family of John Benet Ramsey with like a, you know, a bug in it into the house, had it delivered so that they could eavesdrop. But the family did not like flowers, I guess, so they ended up throwing in the garbage, and it didn't work. But I mean, it's that sort of thing that kind of harkens back to what you're talking about, and kind of shows me like some of the seeds of like what I do in terms of trying to unearth scandal and you know, waste, fraud, abuse that came from Pulitzer, but yet the environment now that we have, I mean, I'm curious what you think in terms of journalism. Like, it's not as freewheeling as it was in his day, and then in the day of William Randolph Hearst. But I guess I wonder, you mentioned, you know, President Trump wasn't yet elected when you started on this film, but I mean, did you see, like, what parallels have you thought about in terms of journalism, you know, from his day and kind of how we are today?
Well, you know, you can't, this film got transformed really once Trump got elected, because Pulitzer had his own battles with presidents, most famously Teddy Roosevelt. And there are, you know, we think of Teddy Roosevelt rather kindly these days, and he did a lot of great things, but he was kind of a bully, and certainly with Pulitzer he was a major bully, and reading about their famous battles reminded me of some of the tit for tat and some of the stuff, the back and forth that goes on and has become so much a part of what we expect from our national leaders. So it became kind of incumbent on me, on us who made the film, to look for parallels, down to the fact that Pulitzer used the term fake news over 100 years ago, and of course one of the things people accuse Pulitzer of, not completely unfairly, is yellow journalism or sensationalism. And you know, Western newspapers back in the day were full of sensationalism and made up stories. So compared to them, he was sticking to the facts pretty much. And only during the Spanish-American War, when Hearst's paper in New York and his started vying ferociously and famously for newspaper readers, did he, in the face of the famous, you know, Remember the Maine, the so-called attack on the Maine, which was probably a self-inflicted something going off inside the boat, but the Spanish got accused, and it became one of the excuses for Roosevelt to get involved in the Spanish-American War and take over, you know, the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba for a time, and so, you know, but I think what I've been interested in, I'm wondering actually what you have to say about it, is the newspapers these days, and specifically the newspapers more than television or internet reporting, you know, and specifically the Times and the Post, you know, have been endlessly bullied by the president and have had to, you know, do all that fact checking, that the endless fact checking, and calling, you know, evolving to the point where, yes, we can call a lie, and we can list, you know, the 3,000 things that he said in the last how many months that were lies. And I think it's a real challenge for newspapers, and I know the Times it's a challenge to figure out how you tell the news. And I think there's been a little bit of a shift, but you tell me, and how you tell the news, like what role a reporter has, even in a news article on the front page, to express an opinion. And I think these were issues that are all over Pulitzer's paper.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's a good question, and it's definitely a challenge because, you know, I think as journalism developed throughout the last century, you know, it moved, that kind of accountability journalism remained, but then things moved towards more like with Watergate and, you know, post that towards this model of, you know, objectivity and just, you know, everything is factual, which doesn't mean that we don't, well, we're not supposed to give opinions in the news pages at all. But, you know, it doesn't mean that you can't, everything is a he said, she said, because you can, if somebody does something wrong, you let the facts speak for themselves. But now, especially since President Trump's rise, it really has become a lot more difficult, and that's been more tested both for the reasons that you mentioned, which is like, you know, that he does not tell the truth a lot, and more so, all politicians don't always tell the truth. I mean, that's really nothing new, but you know, the extent of it, and then the extent to which he also attacks the media and other people. So you have to figure out, and the newspapers have struggled with how to balance, you know, calling him out, because that's part of your role, you know, in terms of saying, okay, this is not accurate. And, you know, then people struggle with, okay, do you actually say that's a lie? Do you call it a lie? Do you just say it's not true? Like, what are all these terms? I mean, so I think from what I've seen in terms of the leadership of the Times and the Wall Street Journal, where I worked before to some extent, and others, is trying to walk that line between being like bold and strong enough to tell people what's correct and investigate it like we do everything else. So you investigate what the president says and does, and you tell people, you know, sometimes you do have to make decisions about what words that you use, because like lie, or, you know, because words are important. But we're not supposed to express opinions. However, the place where it also gets complicated, I think, is because of the politicization of the country now. And like, there's a lot of pressure on the New York Times in particular to kind of like be this voice of the left, and, you know, the Trump, anti-Trump voice. And so, you know, there's this term both sidesism. The Times is always getting attacked for, you know, both sidesism, which is like, you know, you're trying to be overly balanced. And so it's a difficult line to walk. There is more of a push now away from that notion of objectivity that I was talking about before. I don't see it from the leaders of the paper, you know, in terms of advocating that, but like a lot of the staff and other journalists are, you know, they've sort of going back in a way to like this probably thing that might be a relic from Pulitzer's era of where, you know, you can let opinion get into there. I mean, I don't really, and sometimes the Times, you know, and before I worked there, I've seen it, I still see it now. I mean, there's definitely like, if you read the pages of the newspaper, you definitely see language. I mean, this is, are we off the record here? Like, I don't want to be quoted.
I guess we're, well, you can say we're off the record. We can try it.
No tweeting, not, I don't know how much any of you are tweeters, but no, I do look, you definitely see creep in.
The other thing, just because we're in the COVID era, that I've seen the Times do, in Pulitzer's day, there's a whole section of the film talking about how he sought to bring immigrants in by the kinds of stories he had in, and also teaching people how to become Americans, but also having sections for children and games for them and the like. And I've noticed, if anybody still gets, which I urge you all to get, just so you support both your local newspapers, even if you don't read them, and your New York Times or any national paper, to support them financially, because they don't have the ad revenue they had. But what I was driving at is, in Pulitzer's day, he had these pull-out sections for kids and for games and dress patterns and the like and music. And I noticed in the Sunday Times, for those of you who get it, there are sections for children now, full color, full color, fantastic games and things for them to do. And I'm certain that whoever came up, well, I'm not certain, maybe they came up with that idea without knowing about the newspaper history for doing that. They still haven't given in and had comic sections, but they have these wonderful things for kids to do. And, I hope it's popular because I love them.
I don't know, but I'm going to definitely look. I haven't seen that because I don't get I'm embarrassed to say I don't get the Sunday Times delivered, although I've been meaning to. It does remind me of another question I had, though, which is that I was curious what you show how innovative Pulitzer was in terms of both the journalism and the writing, the reporting and the writing and the illustrations. I mean, some of the colors of the pages that you show in the movie are just beautiful. And I mean, did he just reinvent all what he was seeing in the newspapers of his day, or was there some influence from Europe, or do you have any idea where he came up with all of these ideas that he had?
Yeah, well, I like to say that he pioneered all this stuff, but I don't say that in the film because the fact is that many of these things, well, he had a brother who he was famously estranged from, Albert Pulitzer, who had his own newspaper in New York before Pulitzer, and he frankly stole. He wanted to merge with his brother. His brother didn't want to do it, and he stole a lot of those kinds of things from his brother's paper. So but he took them. His genius was he took the graphics, he took the ideas, and he took them to a whole nother degree. So he really understood, and the size of the paper, the paper is at Duke University, and it's exquisite to look at and thankfully for Nicholson Baker, it was preserved. But you can turn to any page of those papers and find yourself reading every single article. They're really well written. He had people like Jack London and other famous people writing for him, but all his writers had a flair. He was a natural storyteller, but he also understood how the eye moves around the page and made sure that your eye did that. And even when he was, he was already going blind when some of the greatest innovations and full color and all the rest were introduced to the paper. So yes, he was a pioneer. Yes, he borrowed a lot. And as they say, good artists borrow, great ones steal. So good publishers borrow, great ones steal. Tell Sulzberger that. I'm sure he knows it.
So yeah, and I mean that kind of also leads into asking you about the darker parts of Pulitzer, because obviously he's a widely, the Pulitzer Prizes are named after him. He's sort of a hero of journalism, and you alluded to some of the the darker sides of him, and you said that you felt like the Newsies storyline of suppressing the Newsies strike, I guess, is overblown. But there's the yellow journalism, some of the fabrication or plagiarism. So how do you balance overall those parts of his storyline with the much more positive ones? And I mean, did you think about how much weight to give those in the movie?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things. There's things that the film doesn't touch upon at all, which is very relevant today, which is the Black Lives Matters movement. read the paper, read his paper, and you won't get all the news about the African American community. It's not, and I kind of, if I have a regret, it's that, you know, the film didn't have enough space and the themes didn't allow, but still to talk more about how the fact that the country at the time was not only misogynist and sexist, but it was also racist. And the advertising of the day is incredibly racist. The articles, I didn't find blatant racism, but I am sure it is there. And I won't say in spades, because I think that may be a racist term in and of itself. But so I think, but true to the people of his day, you know, there were newspapers for the African American community. And so I guess the thought was that's for them to cover. And then during the Spanish American War, yes, he did exaggerate. And there's a famous case of plagiarism, which is in the film, where he quoted verbatim something from Hearst's paper and was caught out doing it in an anagram that, you know, if you haven't seen the films, you know, you can see that. But so he, but I would say overall, you know, his support of the working class and his investigative reporting of the way people lived in those days and the corruption of government, I would say far outweigh his other sins. But they were, you know, sins, and some of them are sins only seen in a historical light, and others are of the day. So I think you have to weigh all this the way we weigh whether we should be tearing down statues, you know, with Abraham Lincoln and then African American at their feet, at his feet, and what did it represent when African Americans funded that sculpture, and what does it represent now? The Robert E. Lee stuff and all the rest of it, that's easy, but there's the much more complicated, subtle racisms and other factors that you know have to be taken into account.
Okay, thank you. Dolores has asked me if I want to comment on Bary Weiss, and I am not. That's really has to do with the opinion pages of the New York Times. There was a controversy of a woman who quit recently and criticized the paper, and the New York Times opinion pages have, because especially recently with the there was an op-ed that they got heavily criticized for, that they published about sending the military, by Tom Cotton, you know, so there's a lot of controversy. There's always a lot of controversy at the Times, sort of along the lines of what I was talking about before, about like kind of, you know, this quote unquote woke liberalism and like, you know, where they should be. But I don't personally get involved in, I have not been there very long, and so I don't have a ton to say about it. She seems like a talented woman who makes a lot of controversial statements, but I don't know a ton about it. But I did want to answer your question. Yeah, Oren, on the lighter side, I mean, I noticed in your you have celebrities in some of your films. You had in your Hasidic film, Leonard Nimoy and Sarah Jessica Parker. Here you have Adam Driver, who, I guess we don't get to see his face in the film, although I'm curious if that's, what's the decision on that. But I mean, how did you pick him? What was he like to work with? And why didn't we get to see him? And anything about your use of celebrities in the films, I'm interested in.
Yeah, well, the fact is, one of my producers is, and I think she's correct, is a big believer that people pay attention to who is in your film, and it's not totally out of the blue that I chose Liev Schreiber, who is a Jew with Hungarian roots, though I'm told not the best Hungarian accent. But but that aside, and I had met Liev many years ago on a fiction project that I was trying to get off the ground, and we had some friendship, and I've been trying to get him to get involved with a film and to narrate a previous film, which he was not comfortable doing because of the politics involved in this film about the Palestinians and Israeli conflict called Colliding Dreams. And Adam Driver was in the film Spotlight, which is a film about the news media. And Adam also is very interested in being part of the conversation. He's been very involved. He was a veteran, and he is a supporter of veterans, and he just we had this illustrious group of people. He was the last person to sign on, but it wasn't because of the fact that he had done Spotlight. It seemed like something he might be interested in, and in fact he was. And sorry you don't get to see him. He is very shy about media attention, and so when I did his agent was very adamant that it just be me, that it was there in the room when we recorded narration, and gave us a very small short window of time to do it in. But I can assure you, he is, to me at least, he was a total as they say, mensch. He was total sweetheart. He really worked hard at doing a good job, and often his instincts were better than mine about how to read. So it was a pleasure working with a whole range of fantastic people like Hugh Dancy and Lauren Ambrose and marvelous Miss Maisel, and and lots of wonderful people who did tiny parts. And I think it's just really they didn't get paid much, so they didn't do it for the money. All these actors, they're doing popular TV shows or movies that they may or may not care about, and I think they want to be. They've heard of American Masters also and PBS, and they want to be a part of the public conversation. And so that was a great experience, actually. I enjoyed almost every minute of those, though they're very pressured things because you only get a short amount of time to get it right. And,
Yeah, I didn't even realize Mrs. Maisel was in the film, so I'll go back.
Brosnahan, Rachel Brosnahan, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose this was with Adam Driver, but you mentioned being media shy before this. I don't know if everyone knows about his famous episode where Terry Gross played him singing from the divorce movie. I think that was the movie.
Marriage Story, yeah.
And he was on Terry Gross's podcast, and I think she played him singing after being warned not to, back to him, and he left. He got up and walked out.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was.
I didn't know about that. I hope did she get enough before then, or she made them?
I don't know if they played it or not. She's had a few people, but she's a very good interviewer.
She is. Yeah. Wow. A bad mistake there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have one question I'll get to in a minute, but just to connect to what you were talking about before in terms of Liev Schreiber, have you done a film before where it was like you recreated some of the characters because nobody you know, the people, it's obviously from the past, and, you know, there's no, I mean, you had the journal or the writers who were on, who were live, but, you know, all the participants are no longer around. So have you done that where you've kind of used that tool to recreate the present?
Yeah, well, you know, frankly, I shy away from that. I love fiction films and narrative films, and I've seen some films that use a lot of recreation and done it well, and seen a lot of films that use recreation where I haven't been fond of it. And I wasn't planning on doing it, but once I got this Panama story, which really related to, for me, to Trump, to the way the presidency is played out these days, I had this whole story which I needed to find a boat, and I needed to find, I didn't know how to tell the story without turning to recreations. And one thing led to another. I had an assistant who literally, I was holding a photograph of Pulitzer as a young man in my hand, and I looked up at my assistant and I realized that he was a doppelganger for Pulitzer from a certain angle. And so I did my first recreation with him as a young man when he's getting his eyes checked. And I thought it went well. And so then I kept adding them. And then the big one was the whole very expensive but very necessary boat recreation. And they're all no-name actors. And then we added voices, so nobody's talking. And I think the hardest thing to do, and we didn't have the budget for it, is to have name actors on location. You know, that would have been our entire budget right there. So it was still quite expensive, but I hadn't really done very minimally in the past. Frankly, I thought it came out well. I thought it worked. I thought it added to the film to be able to have, you know, and then we took the newspapers and recreated them because they were crumbling newspaper. You couldn't take them out of the Duke archives. You had to make recreations of those papers, which I made a lot more than I used, but, and then some of the famous letters that we found that Pulitzer had written. Mm-hmm. So no, I hadn't done it a lot before, and I was pretty pleased with how it came out.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask people. I'm running short of my questions, but there's one in the queue, and anybody else who wants to put some questions in now would be a good time if you want to put them into the chat. Maybe my last question is, can you tell us what you're working on now? Is it a secret, or like what's your next plan?
Well, it's right now it's a project that's very hard to work on because of COVID, and people are, you know, it's one thing to be a writer, but it's another thing to be a filmmaker. I have several projects I'm working on. I began this project called Everything Seemed Possible, which is about an era, a little known era in Puerto Rican history. It's not a Jewish project, though there were Jews involved with the Farm Services Administration who during Roosevelt's day went to Puerto Rico to photograph the country. But it's an era after that where the Governor Munoz Marin, who was known as a poet and politician, started this film unit, which is based on this ethos of elevating the peasants and the real people of Puerto Rico, and made these films using non-actors to talk about this moment of cultural flowering and economic flowering, Operation Bootstrap and the rest in Puerto Rico. And it's set off against the corruption and incompetence and natural disasters of Puerto Rico today. So that's one of the projects I'm working on.
Okay. So I'm going to go to the chat. We have two questions that are actually similar. One was sent to me privately, but they both relate to Pulitzers Judaism. So from I don't know if it's Ava or Ava Reinfeld, but she's asking if Pulitzer had any connection to Judaism during his life in the US. And there's a similar question from, well, everyone can see from Abby about there being little regarding Pulitzer's Jewishness in the film. Can you tell us whether he associated with the Jewish community or any Jewish institution?
Yeah, well, although this film has ended up playing in dozens and dozens of Jewish film festivals across the country and the world, it was not originally intended or as an exploration of Pulitzer's Judaism beyond what I talked about, and which is his growing up in a Jewish community where he was taught. There's very little record, but you can see in the town where he grew up many Pulitzers in the cemetery and their names in Hebrew and not necessarily in Hebrew. But he seems to have, at least in terms of ritual, abandoned it, which his brother did not. His brother's buried and wanted to be buried in a Jewish cemetery in Europe, and Pulitzer made sure that somebody sang the El Malei Rachamim, apparently. And again, this is a bit apocryphal, and I didn't include it in the film, but at the cemetery, which he did not also attend himself. So whatever enmity they had was to the end. He didn't, he seemed to embrace in his personal life, he married an Episcopalian girl from the South who was related to the Southern Confederacy, and he, the Pulitzer family, none of the people that I traced have gone back to Jewish roots. There have been many who have married Jews. And one could say perhaps that he was the kind of Hungarian European Jew who embraced Jewish values, quote unquote, in terms of his concern for the common man and his concern for immigrants. So I like to think that is part of that tradition. But, he funded what became known as the Pulitzer Prizes and the Metropolitan Museum and the Public Library in New York. And he funded food campaigns and the like, and had many other causes. But I didn't find any big record of him giving to the Hebrew Aid Society. I imagine, frankly, he did, but I couldn't find those records. And as I say, it wasn't really the theme I was following in the film beyond what his early years were.
Dorit is asking about anti-Semitism, which she mentions in notes to me that you do allude to the depictions of him with a big hook nose and the descriptions of his name as Pulitzer, etc. But I mean, beyond that, are you aware of other anti-Semitism that he experienced? And
yeah, there were definitely clubs in New York and elsewhere that he wasn't allowed to belong to, but he did have homes in famously Goyish places, and I think there's always the exception made for the extremely famous and wealthy Jews in those places, or maybe people just pretended they didn't know. But it was certainly an anti-Semitic time. But remember, anti-Semitism got worse. He came in 1860s. Anti-Semitism really got worse when the dirty, quote unquote, rabble of, Russia and Poland came to the States. And when it was the Hungarians and Germans, and in smaller numbers, people knew they were Jewish, but it wasn't the same thing as those masses of immigrants.
Okay. So Sarah has asked me, tell us about your book, which I will briefly do. And I had it on hand. This is a book I wrote with Joe Palazzolo, who was my colleague at the Wall Street Journal, and we broke the Stormy Daniels story together in early 2018, and Karen McDougal, who was a Playboy model. So we basically sought to sort of tell in this book, the fixers. It's through the prism of Donald Trump's fixers, because these are the people who, and Donald Trump has had fixers, people who kind of take care of his dirty work throughout his entire business career. And so he had Michael Cohen, his lawyer, who went to prison as a result of our reporting, helping with these hush money deals, and David Pecker, who was also Jewish, and the publisher of the National Enquirer, who paid for Karen McDougal, the Playboy model, who these two women basically were going to tell stories about having an affair with Trump. And so we kind of go back in time to his first fixer, Roy Cohn, the former McCarthy aide, who then became a lawyer in New York to kind of rich people and doing matrimonial law. So Roy Cohn was Trump's first fixer and sort of taught him how to take care of problems. And then we kind of like trace the National Enquirer in its history as a tabloid. And so it's at once like kind of telling the story of these people, of these hush money deals that we unearthed, but in the context of how Trump came up as this, I mean, our agent called it like I forget exactly, but his term was like celebrity media industrial complex, which which essentially means that at some point Trump was part of, with the tabloids, getting celebrity news into the mainstream. He was kind of a big part of that with The Apprentice, and he kind of cavorted with models and sometimes prostitutes and then there's like these lawyers who work in Hollywood, and they sweep dirt under the rug. So they were part of this story, and it's like this is part of the seamy underbelly of Trump's past. And so we put these two hush money deals in the context of all of that in this book, and it was a lot of fun to write. I don't think it sold a ton of copies, but that's okay. It was a lot of fun. So thank you for asking about that, Sarah. And let me just see what else we got here. I think we are, I think Eileen made a comment, but I don't think that's necessarily a question. And does anybody else have questions for us?
What are you writing next?
I've been covering, when the COVID crisis happened, I was reporting on healthcare in New York during the surge. So just a lot of like what was happening in the hospitals. And we recently, there was a emergency room director in New York who took her own life tragically. So we reported on that. That was something.
That piece was fantastic. That was not a setup question, but seriously, that piece was amazing. I really, really was moved by it. So well done, so beautifully done.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a very sad story, and and we spent a couple months kind of this woman who really was just somebody who really liked to try to save people's lives. Like that was really something that she was. She just never liked to let anyone die. And then, then she got sick with COVID during the crisis and went back to work, and everything was so out of control. And then she ended up sort of spiraling herself with her mental health, and, and then felt one of the big parts of that article was that she felt once she had had a kind of a breakdown, and her employer knew that she had been, hospitalized for a mental break, that her career would be over, because there's a big stigma in the healthcare field against mental health, doctors don't think that they're allowed to ever, break down or get sick, and she felt her career would be over, and that could have played a role in her deciding to do what she did. So that was pretty sad.
Fantastic.
So Oren and Michael, I would like to thank you for an absolutely wonderful evening. I know the two of you never met before tonight, but I think maybe you should talk about taking this show on the road. It was absolutely fascinating, and we really had a good time. Thank you, everyone. Watch more movies.
Thank
I
you.
will
Thank
be watching
you.
for new work from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a great night.